is not a spectator sport. So thank you for showing up at this pivotal moment in our history, when we are facing an existential climate crisis and a referendum that will shape the future of our nation. Showing up is the first step in empowering our community. This forum is designed to help us with the next steps. My name is Sarah Russell and I'll be the MC today. As a demonstration of unity between Labor, Greens and the Animal Justice Party, Marg, Jo Hansen and Pamela Engelanda were invited to do an acknowledgement of country. Unfortunately, Pamela has not been well and we wish her a speedy recovery. Welcome to Marg and Jo.
Welcome everybody. We pay our respects today to the Balnarring people of the Kulin Nation and honour their elders past, present and emerging. They hold the memories, the traditions, the culture and hopes of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. A better understanding and respect for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander cultures is critical for an enriched appreciation of Australia's cultural heritage and is the path to reconciliation. It's essential to the maturity of Australia as a nation and fundamental to the development of an Australian identity. We recognise that the land was never ceded and that to create a unified Australia, we must have a process where Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples can have a voice to shape the laws, policies and practices which affect them.
Thanks, Marg. After being at the Sorrento Writers' Festival and listening to Marcia Langdon, Thomas Mayo and Kerry O'Brien and various other incredible speakers, and after deciding that this is probably for me the single most important issue in Australia, I've added this extra part to the acknowledgement. To achieve the voice, we support the Uluru Statement from the Heart, which invites all Australians to walk together towards a better future. We support the voice to give a voice to First Nations people, to work towards closing the gap, which has got bigger. The gap with wealth, health, education and opportunity. As Galawai Yunupingu said, Yotu Indi, coming together. Gama, working together. Makarata, coming together after conflict, making peace together. Treaty. Thank you.
Today's forum has been divided into two parts. During the first hour, speakers have been asked to talk about their community campaigns so we can learn about what works and what does not work. We will then break for afternoon tea and mingling and eating an awful lot of sandwiches. Talking together and networking is vital for our progressive movement. All community work is based on building relationships, trust and a shared vision. So after the break, when you've had a lot of sandwiches, and when you return to your tables, you'll have some work to do. There are 2 questions on your program that we'd like each table to discuss. We have reserved a seat at your table for one of the speakers currently sitting on the stage who will facilitate the discussion. Our first speaker, who you just heard from, but you're hearing from again, is Marg Darcy. So Marg and a number of other people are starting a Yes 23 campaign on the Mornington Peninsula. When I was speaking recently with Karsten, a coordinator at Willamaraine, he described Marg as a great ally. It's time for all non-Indigenous Australians to be great allies. Thank you, Marg.
MP Yes 23 came about in discussion with a few Labor members who wanted to do something to campaign for the voice. We brought together a group with representatives from the 3 branches in the electorate of Flinders, Hastings, Nepean and Mornington. As we talked about it, we identified that we did not want it to be a Labor campaign, but we do want it to be a local campaign. We do not want to feed into the politicisation of what is a very simple invitation from the people who developed the Uluru Statement to walk with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in a movement of the Australian people for a better future. We want a resounding yes vote from the people of the Mornington Peninsula. We would be delighted if Zoe McKenzie would come out in support of a yes vote and would invite her to join our campaign. Just to remind you, this is what was asked of us in the Uluru Statement. We call for the establishment of a First Nations voice enshrined in the Constitution. Makarrata is the culmination of our agenda, the coming together after a struggle. It captures our aspirations for a fair and truthful relationship with the people of Australia and a better future for our children based on justice and self-determination. As I heard Ruben Berg say yesterday, we already have voice in Victoria with the First Peoples Assembly, and that's involved a really long and complex process, which is now at a stage where the negotiations around treaty can proceed. We have a truth-telling process with the Uruk Justice Commission, which is holding government to account. And guess what? The world has not fallen in. We believe it's critical to have a local campaign. We believe it's important to respond to the call recently made at Tootgarook by Thomas Mao for all people to take up the challenge of working towards a yes vote in this federal electorate. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people make up 1.2% of the Victorian population. We cannot leave the responsibility up to them. We must work together to achieve that better future. What is important is to get information out to the community, to explain what the voice is and why we are supporting it. As Teela Reid said recently, whether people vote yes or no, we want to ensure that the vote is based on good and accurate information. We won't win over everybody, but what we can do is ensure that those who we don't win over are at least making an informed choice, not one based on misinformation, prejudice and lies. So far, our plan is, first of all, to ensure everybody who wants to be involved in the campaign has that good information, is able to respond to questions and dispel the misinformation that is around and is likely to become even more prevalent as the campaign goes on. We will encourage people to sign up to the Vic Women's Trust Together Yes campaign, to support them to have conversations and to get information out to small groups. To develop resources. Again, listening to Thomas Mao, what he advocated for was wearing our hearts on our chests. By wearing the symbol of the Yes campaign, we can promote conversations. And it's the conversations that will shift the people who I have heard described as the soft no group, and that will confirm the vote of the soft yes group. There's an order form at the table up there, at the front for t-shirts or hoodies, so we can campaign comfortably in the winter months. We have the permission of the Yes 23 campaign to use the graphics and adapt them for our local use. We're selling the clothing at cost price. We're not making a profit from the sales. We'll also be producing badges and stickers that will be available free of charge. We're going to hold stalls at local markets and shopping centres. We're going to contact local community organisations and sporting clubs to offer information stalls at events or conduct workshops to inform their members. We're going to develop we have developed a social media presence, so look for us on Instagram and Facebook, Mornington Peninsula Yes 23. We're going to promote public forums and other events that are being held around the peninsula, like the Willem Warrain Forum that you've got the leaflet for on the table, and the Swans First Nations Forum on July the 20th. That's where we've got to at the moment. There are numerous ways you can join with us in the campaign. You could join the planning group to help us shape the campaign. If you'd like to do that, please talk to me afterwards or email us on mps23@mps23.org. If you want to be involved in our activities, street stalls, helping with door knocks, presenting to local groups, please put your name that's on the list at the table underneath the Uluru Statement. Oh, okay. If you want to learn how to facilitate conversations, sign up to Together Yes as a facilitator and let us know that you've done that so we can support you and enlist you in talking to small local groups. You could also put your name forward to help put in pre-polling and on polling day. That's going to be just as big a thing, and remember that those last-minute conversations could really make a difference. Finally, if you don't want to do any of the above, but want to show your support and show that there are many people on the Mornington Peninsula who want a yes vote, buy a t-shirt or a hoodie. We are, as I said, we're selling them at cost price. And we will have some available to loan if people are working on street stalls. But if you don't like wearing t-shirts, that's fine too. Let us know and we'll get you a badge. Whatever you do, and whether you join us or not, we hope that you take the time to inform yourself and talk to your family, friends and colleagues about why a yes vote is critical to the future of Australia.
Thank you, Marg. We initially planned to have an Indigenous person speak with us today about the Voice to Parliament, but after speaking with Carsten, we encourage you all to attend the Willow Moraine Cultural Forum on the 31st of May. Our second speaker is Julie Pittle. Julie is well known for her tireless advocacy on many human rights issues. We welcome Julie today.
Thank you. I'd like to acknowledge also that I'm standing on the unceded sovereign lands of the Balnarring people, the South East Kulin Nation. I acknowledge that the ongoing impact of colonisation continues to bring harm to them as we speak. During the pandemic, the discomfort of experiencing a curtailing of personal freedom, which I think many of us experienced, caused some citizens to confuse human rights with civil libertarianism. Indigenous cultures remind us that there are no human rights without human responsibilities. Working towards social and climate justice are just two of these responsibilities. It is time for us to return to the work of centring the importance of human rights in policy making and service delivery, and to the work of rebuilding networks and relationships to share the responsibilities that are ours to bear, as was said here tonight. Just as the pandemic struck, we had planned our Mornington Peninsula Human Rights Oration. We were going to have Lee Carnegie as a speaker speaking about the Bill of Rights, the Federal Charter of Human Rights. Australia is now the only Western democracy without some kind of National Human Rights Act. Ideally, our human rights would be protected in the Constitution, which would require a referendum. However, the Parliament can introduce a Charter of Human Rights at any time, as was done in Victoria. The Human Rights Law Centre is currently writing an Australian Charter of Human Rights and Responsibilities that would protect in law all of our fundamental human rights set out in the United Nations Universal Declaration. It would mean that governments must consider people's human rights when creating new laws and policies and when delivering services. It would also mean that people can take real action and seek justice if their rights are violated. Currently, our anti-discrimination legislation is somewhat toothless. Apart from aged care, disability, health and education, a charter could also protect the right to a livable climate, the right to safe drinking water and the right to housing, issues that we are currently facing today. System change is very slow work, and to remain engaged and motivated, it helps us if we identify achievable gains which can be made working together within and for our communities, as was spoken about. At present, two social issues are very pressing and require our immediate attention as human rights campaigners. So Marg has spoken very eloquently on the Voice to Parliament. I won't mention much more about that, just in relation to the fact that in 2009 we formally endorsed but not ratified the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. Australia has continually failed to meet the standards set out in UNDRIP, and as eloquently outlined in the Uluru Statement and evidenced in the Closing the Gap outcomes, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people still face enormous difficulty in fully realising their human rights. The intervention, the Northern Territory intervention, which is now ended, required a suspension of the Racial Discrimination Act. It's only been suspended 3 times in the history of Australia, every single time in relation to Aboriginal people. So, as Marg said, the Uluru Statement from the Heart provides an opportunity to address this, and where UNDRIP provides the international community with a standard for self-determination, the Uluru Statement provides Australia with a clear, actionable guide, and Marg has presented us with a clear, actionable set of actions, which I will be very happy to be involved in. All right. Also, to note, if anyone is interested, there's a submission open to Parliament at the moment on Australia's human rights frameworks. Anybody can put in a submission. The link to that can be sent to you if you put your name down or your email there, and I'll send you the link. It's open till the 1st of July. As many people who put that forward, that we need a Federal Charter of Human Rights, the more likely it is to actually get up. So the second pressing issue, and this is very topical, is that recently the rights of the LGBTIQ community have come under renewed attack, spearheaded by a loose coalition of freedom movement, sovereign citizens and religious extremists. There's been an organised targeting of LGAs and queer-friendly events, programs and services, including threats of physical violence and harassment that have led to the postponing and cancelling of events. This is causing great distress to the LGBTIQ community, who are already experiencing higher rates of adverse outcomes related to stigma, discrimination, bullying, harassment and violence. It is not widely known there are still exemptions within the Sex Discrimination Act that allow for religious organisations to discriminate on the basis of gender and sexual identity. In addition, there are no robust protections from vilification in anti-discrimination legislation, and there is current debate in Parliament about how to extend these protections by amending current laws. As citizens, we have a key role to play in protecting the right of our fellow citizens to express their gender and sexual identity and have a sense of belonging in their community. Last night, a group of citizens, and this morning actually at Rosebud Library, a group of us joined together to provide a warm welcome to young people attending the Mornington Peninsula Pride Formal. The organiser of that Pride Formal and her family was threatened with actual physical violence. We cheered and clapped the young attendees as they arrived. I'm going to get emotional, sorry about this. And we were prepared to form a protected barrier between them and the threatened protest to the event. There is a pressing need to actively and effectively counter the homophobic and transphobic misinformation and rhetoric that is being broadcast by bigots through social media and which is threatening the human rights of the queer community. If you would like more information on the issues and links referenced today, or you're interested in meeting monthly to take action on human rights issues, you can provide your email address on a sheet at the info table. We have a Facebook page, Mornington Peninsula Human Rights, where we post regular daily information on human rights issues and campaigns. You can direct message us via the page. I will see you all in this campaign. If you wish to get more information about the Frankston Mornington Peninsula LGBTIQ Collaborative, which is doing some fantastic work at the moment, and the upcoming Pride on the Peninsula organising, please contact me about that. Thank you all for listening and for your commitment to a more progressive and humane society.
Well, thank you, Julie. Our next speaker has a good news story to tell us about a community... Oh, it's a little Jack, sorry, distracted by a dog. Has a good news story to tell us about a community that valued a social and cultural asset and was prepared to fight to keep it. The success of the Save the Flinders campaign, the Save the Flinders Pier campaign, showed what can be achieved when a community comes together to unite around something we love, and they loved. Who knows? This may inspire us all to unite about something that we all love, our planet. Welcome, Charles.
I think that'll be fine.
Okay.
Good, thanks very much for that, Sarah, and thank you everyone who's turned out today to listen to all of us. Everyone's got a slightly different story to tell. My story is about the Flinders Pier. It was an initiative of the Flinders Community Association, and we have our president, our former president, in the audience today, so she's going to make sure that I stick to the straight and narrow as I sort of retell the tale. The Save Flinders Pier campaign is interesting in that it hinged on two things: an overarching objective to make us look much bigger than we actually were, and a written strategy from the very start that carefully mapped each step. Mobilising and genuinely uniting a community in a way that hadn't been done in Flinders in a similar way, or if it hadn't been done for a very long time. Framing a response to a government decision that everyone understood and drew people in to support us, and functioning on a principle of inclusivity by making people feel personally that the pier belonged to them. So it was the divers and the swimmers, it was the artists, the environmentalists, it was the commercial fishermen, the history lovers, the visitors and the residents. It was people from within Flinders, from outside Flinders, from across the Mornington Peninsula, across Melbourne, across Victoria, and then, as we later discovered, from further afield than that. Our primary goal was to exaggerate our size, because Flinders is not a big place. We posted online continuously. We ensured Mornington Peninsula News had something to run nearly every fortnight. We used talkback radio whenever an opportunity arose. We displayed signs across the peninsula, across all the walking tracks. We had a group of volunteers who cleaned the beach. We had a group of volunteer divers who would go down and clear litter from underneath the pier, and each of these were events from which we were able to create some publicity. We ran an art competition across all the local schools, undertook our own pier condition report, produced a range of merchandise, which I'm still wearing. We towed a trailer up and down the Mornington Peninsula with placards stuck to the side, and we'd park it in different townships along the peninsula. We towed that same trailer into Melbourne metropolitan area, and everywhere we towed it, we'd take a photo and write up a story, and we'd post it on social media. We built a media profile with the major newspapers, and Flinders Pier became a common reference point for other piers in disrepair. We wrote letters to the editor, very old school, but once again, more often than not they would publish those letters. And everything we did was with one objective, and that was to feed the media clipping services that the government employs. So any of you or anyone who's worked in government or big organisations will know that the media is being clipped all the time because people want to know what's going on, what's being said about them. So our job is like a hack. It was to game that process by giving those media services lots and lots of things to clip. And they're doing the same with social media. They're clipping social media and reporting on social media. So we used that very strongly as well. We partnered with the Flinders District Historical Society to launch an application for heritage listing that was ultimately successful. We corresponded with Parks Victoria. We reached out to all 128 members of the Upper and Lower House of State Parliament to get them thinking and talking. Even though it might not have been in their electorate, we wanted them to think this was an issue that might affect them, so they needed to pay attention. And we engaged directly with all our local politicians and local candidates. We simultaneously reviewed legislation and conducted research using freedom of information to better understand the decision and authority to demolish the pier. And what we discovered began to alarm us. But it also fuelled our campaign. When you run a campaign like this, the government wants to give you gifts. And freedom of information is one of those gifts. You'd be surprised what you find out. You're surprised how much you can actually use then in the conduct of your own campaign. As we found out more, we actually built a case for the State Ombudsman to conduct her own review. about the decision and the behaviours of Parks Victoria. It was, in our view, in contravention of the Waterways Management Act under which Parks Victoria operates. We didn't pursue it, but it was just something to have up our sleeve. We met with, we were delegated to a political advisor instead of the Minister or Parks Victoria. That is another story. So there was also a breakdown in the probity and governance in terms of the way the government dealt with us. Something else that we kept in our back pocket. I think in terms of summary, the 5 takeaways for me now that the Pier is saved is community change or community-driven change is always possible. The wisdom of crowds can offer solutions in the most unexpected ways. Listen carefully to the smallest voices who are often the source of the best ideas. Take the time to study and understand the detail, especially if it involves government, and have a strategy, but also plan for the end, because victory or failure often comes very suddenly, and you need to know what to do when that time comes. Thank you very much.
Well, there's a lot of ideas there for how we can save the planet, so we better get cracking. Our next speaker, Dr. Marg Fancett, is President of the Peninsula Preservation Group. The Save Arthur's Seat website states, controversial quarry plans ditched in massive win for people power. Marg will talk about the success of the Save Arthur's Seat, No Tip, No New Quarry campaigns and the challenges ahead. Welcome, Marg.
Thank you, Sarah, for organising today. It's been very interesting listening to the various groups. And certainly PPG was formed in 2013 when we heard from a number of residents. A person on council actually contacted one of the residents and said, did you know that the council was working with the Ross Trust to establish a landfill on Arthur's Seat? So very quickly that campaign developed. It took about 8 months. And in August, at the end of that year, the EPA actually knocked back the quarry proposal on the grounds that it was an unacceptable risk to the water table and to Port Phillip Bay. At the time, the EPA said that it was the most objections they'd ever received for a proposal. So we thought after 8 months of fairly intensive work, and that was basically every night the management group were working on that proposal, that we thought, that's it, 8 months, we're successful. Unfortunately, the Ross Trust wasn't finished. In 2018, they decided that they wanted to now quarry the site, and they were going to clear 90 acres of bush on the site, and they were going to use the funds from that to support their charitable donations. They were set up as an environmental trust. So they were going to fund their environmental donations by destroying an environment in another place. So once again the fight was on, and it took 3 years before, late 2021, the Ross Trust announced that they were no longer proceeding with the quarry. Now the EES is still sitting on the desk of the Planning Minister. It hasn't officially been finished. It can start up at any stage. So we are still fighting for the ultimate protection of the land. It's been very interesting over the last month or so looking at a lot of the media that's come out about the Franklin River and looking about that campaign 40 years ago. And what's similar about campaigns that are running now and some of the differences as well, and I'll talk a little bit about that as well. One of the main things is that you have a good story to spread, and that you spread that as far and as wide as you can. And that was our whole focus for the 10 years that we've been fighting to protect the site. One of our main efforts was to not be political in any of our comments, to not be critical of either side of government, because over the 10 years we've had to work with federal Labor, federal Liberal, and same in the state politics as well. So we want to keep it apolitical. And certainly on our management group as well, we tried to make sure that any of the decisions we made, any of the publications we made, they were completely apolitical. And it was quite interesting. On our management committee for 10 years, we've had such a diverse range of people. We had one of our management group was part of Extinction Rebellion, and sitting next to her was a major donor for the Liberal Party. And they managed to actually function and work really well together for 10 years, which I thought was amazing. Certainly one of the differences from 40 years ago is social media, and that's one of the huge advantages that small community groups have to grow very quickly. Things like change.org, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, etc. So we started off quite small. By 2021 we had over 100,000 people on our mailing list, which was quite amazing. About 50,000 of them were from the Peninsula, and about 50,000 were in Melbourne as well. And obviously that comes from the fact that obviously the Mornington Peninsula attracts a lot of people down here. That attracting numbers, that was something that we tried to do all the time, and that working on publicity, as Charles was saying, trying to constantly get a different angle that we can attract the media. The media want a new story. They don't just want the same story over and over again. So you have to look at different angles. So we were looking at the medical effects of having a massive quarry on the site. We were looking at the damage to biodiversity. We were looking at all sorts of different things to actually see that we could get an angle. You know, the controversy over the fact that an environmental organisation was funding that by destroying the environment. The one thing about getting extra numbers was we got extra expertise in the local community, and we had people coming on board. We had video editors, we had marketing managers from big corporations, we had public relations, we had legal firms offering pro bono support, we had urban planning experts, we had scientists, we had financial experts, and we had media experts as well to help us along the way. That also, increasing the numbers, meant increasing fundraising. And one of the biggest advantages that developers have is that they've got unlimited resources. And unfortunately, community groups need the money. If you're going to do newspaper advertisements, flyers, funding scientific reports, some of them are in excess of $50,000 a shot. So that was a major focus. Selling lots of merchandise as well, that raised lots of money. As I said, pro bono legal support. We had Arnold Bloch Liebler and Cause Chambers Westgarth, two of the most prestigious law firms, writing submissions for us pro bono. We had a public relations firm working for us. We had corporate communications advising us on our digital policy. We had lobbyists working for us as well. So it's spreading that word, getting more and more people involved has flow-on effects that are really important. Where to now, just quickly, as I said, the proposal is still open, but we are lobbying now for the incorporation of the site into the surrounding Arthur Seat State Park, and also the establishment of a sanctuary to allow reintroduction of species that have been lost to the peninsula, things like the spotted quoll and the southern brown bandicoot that should be in that area now. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Mark. Look, we also saw a collaboration between local community and environmental groups in the David and Goliath struggle to defeat AGL's gas plans in 2021. However, just when we thought Westernport was safe, along comes another giant Goliath fossil fuel company. So it's my pleasure to introduce Jane Carnegie, who's known to many of you, and she's going to talk about not only how they saved Westernport, but the battles ahead. Thank you, Jane.
Well, thanks everyone for coming, as other speakers have said, and just listening to those speakers, I am actually quite amazed, and I think the thing about the progressives on the peninsula is that we can all actually learn from each other. I think Save Westernport did so many amazing things, but listening to the way in which some of these other campaigns have occurred, we certainly could have done with some of that input from the law firms that you mentioned. and all that collaboration. But what I'd like to do now is really just share my thoughts about some of the key aspects of the campaign. I know many of you in the room were part of that campaign and you're really familiar with what it was all about. So I won't go into too much detail there. It's really just, in a sense, to share my thoughts as a member of the steering committee of Save Westernport on what I think were some of the key factors that led to the success. I've called my little presentation Empowering Communities and Creating Community Power, because I think that's what we're all doing here, and collectively we can in fact do so much more. So I think the key points that I really wanted to raise have been raised by some of the other speakers, and in that there's obviously a community of thought about what is important. I wanted to start with our steering committee because I think the steering committee is so important in helping to facilitate that huge community involvement that we had with the AGL campaign. And it's just so important in guiding the way in which we had to deal with so many of the different issues that we encountered. A great community steering committee, I think, is at its core built around collaboration, respect and cohesiveness. And we have to recognise that people coming onto a steering committee will have different strengths, and in that lies the power. If we were all the same, we wouldn't get anywhere, but we rely on and we build on particular strengths of the people that are in steering committees. To all who've been part of the Save Westernport Steering Committee, I just give a big shout out. I think they are all amazing people. Coming out of that sort of work, I think the second and crucial element to building a successful campaign is the obvious one. It's about how we engage the community, how we create that catalyst for action. And at every opportunity, like the other campaigns you've heard about, we worked tirelessly to try and get that message out. We knew what was at stake, but for so many in the community, it was an unknown. And many in the community thought there was nothing really to see here. You know, we already had major fossil fuel companies on the peninsula in Westernport, and this was just another one. So we really had to get that message that this was just such a major threat to Westernport, its environment and its ecosystems. And we had to also change understanding about Westernport, often the poor cousin to Port Phillip Bay on the other side of our peninsula, and to recognise the extraordinary ecosystems that live and breathe in that bay. And of course the mangroves, the seagrasses and so forth that capture carbon all the time. So it's a mindset change about the bay on our doorstep. And so we did all the things that others have talked about to get that message through: social media, newsletters, flyers, local newspaper articles, magazine articles, community stalls, rallies, town hall meetings, including one here back in 2019, which we had over 500 people, and protests to try and get that message through. And from there, I think the next element in the success is that we scaled it up. We scaled it up, in a sense, beyond local community to try and get through to some of the key organisations, both around the state and regionally, that would come on board with the campaign. So whilst we sort of led the charge against AGL, we got many, many other organisations, both local and statewide, to come on board. And that builds power, that builds influence, and that builds recognition in government circles. Some, like Environment Victoria, were there from the very start, or almost the very start, and they played such a crucial role in working in partnership with SWP. And they used their knowledge, their guidance on campaigning to help us in what we were trying to do. So a big shout out to Environment Victoria. And then so many other groups came on board, so that we ended up with what we called a really broad coalition or alliance of groups that in the end, when we were confronted with the EES hearings, we had over 10,000 submissions to the EES. It was the biggest in the state's history, and over 25 key organisations participated in the hearings and took out the time to have their say on what they thought was so wrong with this project. And many, many other individuals also, in what is an extremely daunting process to participate in. Our own Mornington Peninsula Council, and I'm glad to see David here, came out, they listened to the community, and they came out in strong opposition to the project. And the work that they did in the hearings was just so important, I think, to the end success. The fourth point I wanted to talk about has also been talked about by others, and that is the resources component. So at our level, we had all these other organisations that had helped us, but we also needed volunteers. We needed so many people to come and help do all those amazing things that we were doing around the community. And there were so many volunteers, but there were also people that just emerged, in a sense, out of nowhere to do something because they wanted to be part of the campaign and to contribute in the best way that they could. So we had a young woman, Hannah Marino, who organised the amazing paddle out, which many of you may have been involved in. We had the Surf Riders Association come out and stand on the steps of Parliament in wetsuits and surfboards while we had the media present to get across our message. And we had the Climate Angels, without any of our knowledge from, say, Westernport, simply come and appear on the mudflats at Crib Point and provide another really important media opportunity. And of course, with so many issues involved, the other key resource we needed was money. Money, money, money. How can a community group, or even multiple community groups, compete against the money of a company like AGL? Well, we did, and we did so because we had an amazing fairy godmother who appeared when we needed her most. Penny Gebhardt from Silverleaf Gallery came forward, organised an online art auction in the height of COVID, and that auction was so successful it gave us the resources to be able to hire lawyers, because we didn't get them pro bono, and experts, although some of those were pro bono. It was amazing. And AGL in that process lost about $130 million, so that was a key success. Building political nous, which others have talked about, was also important. At the end of the day, the key determinant of this campaign was the government and what would it do in its decision making. It was the decision maker. AGL might have been our enemy, but the decision maker was the Victorian government. So we learnt a lot about how to ensure that part of our strategy was to work at that level. And then we had to learn to navigate the entire complex process of an EES, which is so daunting for so many. And try not to drown while we were doing this, to keep still waving, as I call it, because the campaign, not as long as Arthur's seat, but was 3 really, really hard years of our lives. At the time when most of us were locked down as well. And so on to victory, as Paul Keating once said, this is the sweetest victory of them all. I think for many of us who threw our lives into this David and Goliath effort, this was such a sweet victory. It was a community victory, a victory for the many Davids and Davidas who participated in the process. So on to some of the other issues that we now confront. I really want to talk primarily about the coal to hydrogen project, which is around. Many of you may have heard of it, many of you may not. I won't go into it in detail now, but this is such a major threat if this gets any legs. It's using brown coal from the Latrobe Valley, turning it into hydrogen, producing more emissions than generating electricity to create that hydrogen, shipping it down here, turning it into a liquid form, and then sending it to Japan as clean energy. It is nothing clean about it for us. It is nothing green about it for us. It is an absolutely abominable notion. And I think Hopefully, you know, there were good signs with the federal budget that the federal level people are looking at green hydrogen, not blue or brown hydrogen as we call this. But I ask everyone, if you know you've got half an environmental bone in your body, to use someone else's phrase, you have to get on board, and we have to defeat this now, not just sort of let it linger, defeat it now. Finally, on a positive note, after the AGL campaign, many of us got involved in what we thought was the way forward for Westernport, not in Westernport, but many regions, but Westernport in particular, and that was to build a strategic framework for Westernport, a positive approach so that we don't have to keep having these bloody battles, these fights. And so, again, organisations like EV, the VNPA, Save Westernport, the Phillip Island Conservation Society, and many of the other groups that are in this room have come together and tried to seek that way forward. And all we want is very simple, is a new strategic plan for Westernport, a collaborative management partnership with key agencies, the Bunurong and the community to manage that, and a dedicated fund to implement the plan and ensure the future of Westernport Bay. We obviously need the government to support this, and we've been working tirelessly to get that support. Many businesses and many individuals have come on board, and now 2 local councils have signed up, Bass and Cardinia, and we hope that Mornington Peninsula Council is on the cusp of doing so as well. With that council support, we can really build the strength of this concept. There are some postcards on the community table. If you haven't filled them out, please send a message to the government, to Ingrid Stitt, the Minister for the Environment, that you support this approach for Westernport Bay. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Jane. Wow. Well, our final speaker is Angus Barnes. Angus has a really inspiring story about how a community of like-minded people, like us, but they were in Geraldton and they came together to achieve some truly amazing things. And we're hoping that progressives of the Peninsula can learn from our friends in Western Australia. Thanks, Angus.
So thank you for inviting me here. It's very exciting to hear the stories of the Peninsula, and just to be transparent, I live in Seaford, but obviously use the Peninsula a lot for recreation and enjoy the environment here. Sarah, as she said, asked me to talk about Geraldton, and I'll touch on that, but I thought also just, you know, it's totally inspiring listening to these stories of what's been happening in the Mornington Peninsula, and I think comparing that with Geraldton in Western Australia, there's a lot more structure, resources, knowledge to draw from to help you with thinking about your ideas today and going forward. So that's a wonderful resource that you have. My background is, you know, when I thought about it, probably I've lived in social change and worked in social change all my life. I grew up in Tasmania during the 70s and 80s. So the Lake Pedder issues, the Franklin Dam issues were a lived experience for me. And then I went and worked in international development, so for 20 years trying to create developing projects in developing countries and living in some of those countries as well. And that was always about social change. And you just learnt that big, you know, statewide or countrywide structures tended to dissipate quite quickly. But if you got traction at the local level, if the local communities were involved in developing stuff, that had a lot more sustainability going forwards. And then, as Sarah said, I ended up in Geraldton, Western Australia, doing some research around social change there. And so just to share with you, you know, it was academic research, so it got a bit highfalutin and philosophical, but one of the philosophers I studied was Bruno Latour, a French philosopher or sociologist. And he talked about actor network theory. And his point was that power doesn't reside in an individual per se. You know, it's not something that's going to happen necessarily, but power resides in individuals that speak on behalf of a network. So it's that network behind them and them voicing the views of that network that gives them the power. So that's, you know, an achievable aim, but it's also good because in creating networks, we can achieve power too. And a lot of what you've heard from these speakers is how they went about creating the network using the various media, social media and other instruments to then build that network to the point where the person speaking on behalf of that network had power. Now I think they've given you a really good blueprint for action, so how do you do that? And it's almost like we need a little guidebook to sort of consolidate that all. I mean, we've heard the successful stories. I'd just suggest too that important to hear about the stories that didn't work, because often in those failures you can find elements too that are good to point out to people. And also success is often built on failures. You know, Franklin Dam achieved its aims because Lake Pittle failed. And a lot of people involved in both campaigns had learnt their lessons. So to Geraldton, and I think this goes to your task after the talks, what actions do you want to take? I just say think big. How many people here have heard of Edward de Bono and the 6 Thinking Hats? Right, okay. So he's a big person internationally. In Geraldton, he came to visit the community and stayed there for a week, voluntarily. This is a man that charges corporates $20,000 a day, probably more now, that was back then. And that was brought about just by one person in the community writing to him, having read his most recent book where he said he wanted to work with community, and said, well, why don't you come and be king of Geraldton for a week? And we can offer you bikers, you know, picking you up from the airport in tutu outfits and jesters and courtiers and, you know, played on the whole theme of the king. So it was quite an incredible week in Geraldton. But also that came about because of a whole range of actions that had happened in the previous, 10, 20 years. One of the things was they had debated about their vision for place. So we've heard a lot here about people talking about their vision for place. And it had been quite a divisive debate because there was going to be a steel mill on the coast, people didn't want that. There was going to be, heritage knocked down, people didn't want that. People wanted more art in the community. So there was competing visions. But finally, a group came together, partly because the business community didn't have their hoped for steel mill and were looking at other options. And they actually created a slogan called "Give me Geraldton any day." And that became a unifying banner across all the sectors of the society that people fell in behind. And so when they had Edward de Bono visit for the week, and he also came back a year later for a few days too, they had a community that was engaged, that was willing to support that opportunity and also learn from it. So I'll just say, in developing your actions, think big. Don't be too reserved in what you want to achieve or how you want to achieve it. And in terms of that vision for place, I think the other thing that was quite remarkable was the protest group that had been fighting against putting this steel mill on the coast, which was also going to create a port that the crayfishermen and the windsurfers and others were not so happy about. They actually created this was in 2000, so they wrote a document, Oakajee. Oakajee was the industrial estate that the state government created. Oakajee 2010. And in that they put what that land, because it had been demarcated and people had been moved off the land, what that could become. And they talked about things like renewable energy and community, level farming ideas and that sort of thing. So flip forward, 23 years from when they wrote that document, the Oakajee estate still doesn't have a steel mill on it, but now the plans of the Western Australian government are to use it as a wind resource, a solar energy resource, a renewable energy hub, with the plans to create hydrogen. So, often the community is a bit more tapped into visions than what our leaders may want us to believe. So be confident in where you think you can take, your dreams for the place. So thank you and good luck with the planning exercise.
Well, thank you to all our speakers, just for reminding us and also inspiring us about what can be achieved when the community works together. It has also been a call to arms for all of us who care about climate action, who care about social justice and gender and race equality and kindness. If we work together, we can make change happen. Imagine what we could achieve if we could bring the Mornington Peninsula's like-minded community groups and individuals together to collaborate and unite and use our skills, as Hannah mentioned, to unite about the issues that matter to us. Imagine what we could be if we all united. We had a team of people organising today, and I really want to thank them for just working together collaboratively and happily, and we had a lot of fun. So Barbie Wilson, Erica Churchill, Marg Darcy, Andrea Gow's at the back, and Lee Sheldon, who I think is still in East Timor, but he was very instrumental at the beginning because he kept saying, why would people want to turn up to that? So we had to make it something that you'd want to turn up to. So thank you, everybody.